it's Mrs. Jeffries. We are back with Lunch Money. Today we are going to read Chapter 15, Lessons. Friday night in the Kenton house was a family movie night, but tonight Ross and Edward had gone out with their high school friends, which was just fine with Greg. That meant that he got to pick the movie. By 7:30, Greg had his mom and dad, half the couch, a big bowl of popcorn, a bottle of root beer, and good old Indiana Jones all to himself. The movie started with a bang. Between the action and the music and the sound effects, Greg barely noticed the doorbell, barely noticed his mom got up to answer it. She came back to the family room and said, "Greg, it's Mara Shaw." With his eyes still on the screen, Greg said, "What?" She said, "Put the movie on pause." When the room was quiet, she said, "It's Mara Shaw at the door." "Mara," Greg said, "what does she want?" His mom shrugged. "She just asked if you were home." Greg took a quick sip of root beer and got up off the couch. Mara stood by the door. She held a big brown mailing envelope, and before Greg could say a word, she handed it to him. "New drawings. I did them after school, and you have to look at them before I make any more, just to tell me how I'm doing. I know I've got the size right because they're just like the ones in your crayon story, and I used good art paper because I know you have to put ink on them, but you have to tell me about everything else." Did Mara say, "Is this a bad time?" No. Did she say, "I'll leave them here so you can look at them"? No. She stood there, tapping her foot, bossy as ever. Greg hated cold popcorn, and he wished that he'd kept his mouth shut about Mara's pictures. He ripped open the envelope and yanked out the paper so he could whip through them. Then he could push this intruder out the door and get back to his movie. But Mara's first picture grabbed him and pulled him in. She'd done the cover art. The picture focused on the unicorn, its long, twisted horn poking up all the way through the word unicorn in the title. It was a nice touch. But best of all, Mara had drawn dark woods with a scary outline of bare trees, and in the distance, a tower. And in the bottom right corner of the picture, an ogre lurked in the undergrowth, his eyes huge, jaws wide. Greg nodded. "Great cover, really, this is great." And without thinking, he sat cross-legged in the front hall carpet and flipped to the next picture, which was page 1, where the unicorn first realizes she's lost. The small page was split in half from the upper right corner to the lower left corner, which made 2 panels shaped like a triangle. The top panel showed a frightened creature walking through the forest path, looking back over her shoulder. The dividing line was a jagged lightning bolt, and below it was a close-up of the unicorn's eyes looking up at storm clouds, with the woods and the darkness crowding in. Still nodding, Greg looked at the third drawing and said, "This is good too." Mara had already figured out how to use every little bit of space, a big challenge on such tiny pages. One larger panel helped the reader understand the whole scene, and the other smaller ones zoomed in on the most dramatic details. She'd also trimmed the story down into a real comic book script. The words were penciled into speech balloons. "Greg?" It was his dad. "Should we hold the movie?" No, it's okay," Greg called back. I've seen it, and I have to help on this a little. It's some drawings. We'll be down in the playroom. I'll be in there later." At the moment, Mara's sketches were a lot more interesting than the Temple of Doom. Greg wanted to try inking 1 or 2 of them. "Here," he handed all the drawings back to Mara and pointed her towards the basement doorway. "Go down there. I got some stuff in my room." 3 minutes later, Greg carried a bin of art materials into the playroom. He dragged a chair over and set up a work area on the ping pong table. He took Mara's cover picture out of the envelope, hurried upstairs to the family room, ignored his mom and dad and the movie, and made 2 copies on the cover. Practice sheets. Greg trotted back to the playroom, sat down and chose a small brush, dipped it in a bottle of India ink, and began to experiment. The unicorn was going to be white, so that meant he had to darken everything around it. He loved working with the sharp contrast of black and white. He put down the brush, picked up a pen, and dipped it into its thin middle point into the ink. Time to add some detail to the unicorn. Mara came and stood behind him, craning her neck to see. Greg ignored her. She moved to his right side, put a hand on the ping pong table, and leaned in closer. "Hey," said Greg, "don't shake the table." "Well, what am I supposed to do?" she asked. "Do whatever you want. Watch TV, go home. I don't care, just don't shake the table. Here, take this paper and a ruler, and here's some pencils and erasers in the bin. Make some more drawings, and you can go sit over there." Mara set up this little workspace that on a low table in front of the TV. She sat on the floor with her back against the couch facing Greg. She shuffled through her envelopes of papers. She got out her story script and found the next page she wanted to work on. She used the ruler to draw the boundaries of the page. Then she made a few marks on the paper. She looked at them and then erased all around them. She made another start, but then stopped and rubbed it all out again. She couldn't get into it, and she knew why. Sitting on the floor in Greg Kitten's playroom was, well, it was just a little weird. Mara got up quietly, tiptoed over next to the ping pong table. She stood at Greg's elbow, watching him add tiny lines with a crow quill pen. And when it looked like a good moment to speak, she said, "I forgot to tell you something. I really want to do all the lettering myself." Greg looked up at her and made a face. "Well, it can't be in cursive like you did before. It's too hard to read, especially when it's small. How's your printing?" "Are you kidding?" said Mara. "Mrs. Layton in 3rd grade, she had to force me to use cursive. I was so good at printing." Greg reached up for the lettering pen, the kind with a point that's almost like a needle. He unscrewed the cap and slid a piece of lined paper towards Mara. "Here, this is the kind of pen you have to use. Don't push too hard or you'll wreck it. Try writing something." Mara made a few marks just to get the feel of the pen. And then she wrote, "This pen is different, but I like it." Greg looked at the sentence and nodded. "Pretty good." It was actually neater and clearer than his own lettering, and he'd been working on this for 2 years. He said, "But you'll have to practice and get it a little smaller, and you'll have to keep watching how many words you use. The fewer, the better." "I know," said Mara. "Oh, so now you're the expert, right?" "No," snapped Mara, "but I'm not dumb. I really do get it, how the pictures have to tell most of the story, so don't talk to me like I'm an idiot." Greg bit back a perfect insult. He pointed at the other table and said, "So go be a genius over there, okay? I'm trying to get something done here." For the next 30 minutes, there was no talking, only the soft scratching sounds of pens or pencils on the paper. Greg's mom came out to ask if they wanted something to eat, but she stopped halfway down the stairs and she crept back up. She didn't want to interrupt because what she saw reminded her of 2 kindergartners at the art table, each child bent over some work, each completely unaware of the other, which wasn't quite true. Yes, Mara was working on a new mini page, and she was in that quiet, creative zone in her mind, but in the back of her mind, she kept thinking she wished she could just go over and stand behind Greg, watch him lay down those clear brush strokes and the impossibly thin lines of ink. The kid was creative, smart too, and almost nice sometimes, like when he'd apologized in the lunchroom earlier that day, and even when he was acting all tough and mean, he was still funny, like when he made her buy that ice cream sandwich as part of the deal. Mara had to admit it. Sometimes Greg was, well, actually kind of cute. And Greg hadn't forgotten that Mara was sitting 10 feet away. He glanced up every few minutes, just a flick of his eyes as if to make sure that she was still there. Her talent was amazing, and she seemed willing to try anything. Of course, any minute now, she'd probably go nuts again and do something that would make him want to strangle her. But when she wasn't trying to rule the world, like when she kept her big mouth shut and she was there just wrinkling her nose at the drawing, Mara wasn't that bad to have around. And come to think of it, a girl who loved comics? How cool was that? Almost an hour later, Greg broke the silence. "There, 2 pages in the cover, all inked. You get anything done?" Mara nodded and stood up stiffly. 2 more pages." She walked over and laid them on the ping pong table. Greg stood up and pulled Mara's new penciled pages together. As he reached over and he spread the finishing ink in front of Mara, and then they both leaned over to the table, each inspecting each other's work. They were both impressed with what they saw, but there wasn't any gushing. "Yeah, those are okay," Greg said. Mara nodded. "Yours too." The phone rang and Mara said, "Bet you anything that's my mom." It was, and Mara had to leave. "Here," Greg said. "Take these home and do the lettering. You can borrow my pen." Mara nodded and Greg sat down and went back to work. She said, "I'm going to bring my pictures over tomorrow." Greg shrugged. "Whatever." Then he thought a second and said, "But don't come until about 2. He had promised to wash both of the Jansens' cars before noon, and he had Saturday chores at home too. Plus, his brothers might be gone by 2 in the afternoon, and they were always worth avoiding. Mara gathered her things together and left. Greg didn't walk to the front door with her. He didn't even say goodbye. He was too busy. Greg stayed at the ping pong table almost another hour, and before he went to say goodnight to his mom and dad, he had finished inking 2 more pages. As he lay in bed looking at the patterns of the street light and tree branches made on the ceiling, Greg thought about the evening. Inking Mara's drawings had been so different from working on his own pictures. He felt like he had to be more careful with hers. more careful not to put too many of his own ideas in them and careful not to change her drawing style. And he had to admit it. The results were good. As he drifted towards the edge of sleep, there was something else he would not want to admit. Admitting this other thing would have been dangerous. But because when Greg wouldn't admit that he was almost, sorta, maybe a little bit halfway glad about Mara coming back to work on her comics again on Saturday at 2. Next time we're together, we will read chapter 16, Art and Money. Bye-bye.